and leads South Metro's 13 members in the effort to promote water efficiency, partnerships, and investments in water projects. Eric is also president of the CFWE board and participates in the statewide funding committee. April Montgomery is the VP of Programs for the Telluride Foundation, where she has worked for 10 years helping to manage their nonprofit building capacity efforts, grant program, and initiatives. April has served as the Southwestern representative to the Colorado Water Conservation Board since 2009 and served as chair last year during the drafting of the Colorado Water Plan. For now, April and Eric are wearing their CWC board and state funding committee hats. Welcome. We have April on the line as well. Well, Eric, maybe you can start us off by briefly explaining what's included in the $20 billion funding gap and what isn't.
Sure. So the 20 billion number, I believe, came from a lot of the work that the CWCB did looking at the basin implementation plans and looking at the various projects that are included in that, and then making some assumptions about future costs, and then using that to make an estimate of what types of funding is going to be needed going into the future. But now that April's joined us, maybe she has a little bit more information.
Hi, you guys. Sorry about that. This is what happens in a rural community when your phone is connected to the internet and it just dropped. Perfect timing. Go ahead, Eric, because I just missed the first part of what we were talking about.
Okay, I was just talking a little bit about what was included in the $20 billion dollar that's in the Colorado Water Plan, and I was talking about how it comes out of CWCB took a look at the basin implementation plans, and then looked at the types of projects that were needed and made some estimates about the type of funding that would be needed in order to complete all of those types of projects. And then I believe that they then went on to look at what portion of that, the vast majority of that would come from local water users and the end users, but that there was about a $3 billion difference between what was estimated and what was potentially available from both local sources and state funding sources.
You summed it pretty well. Can you see the slides, or am I supposedly sharing the slides?
You cannot currently see the slides, but
okay,
you do have the option to share your screen.
Yep, let me do that. I'm not seeing the share my screen come up. Can you, there we go. Okay, so the slide that should be coming up kind of explains what Eric was just talking about it, and I think that's it. It's I guess the good news is that even we talk about this 20 billion that is in the water plan, when you actually look at what it covers and the fact that it's assumed that 70% of the 20 billion is to be provided by the water providers, and that really there's only the 6 billion that's underfunded. Part of that will come from loans and grants. So the short of it is we're looking for about 100 million per year in new funds to fund the water plan.
And kind of looking at that funding that already exists, Eric, can you explain, I guess, kind of those traditional funding sources?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of categories of how these various parts are going to be funded. When we tend to think of funding sources, we tend to focus a lot on different state funding sources, and that's appropriate because after about the 60s and 70s, when the federal government through the Bureau of Reclamation really stopped funding large water projects, the states then stepped in to try and fill some of that gap with their various funding streams. And so in Colorado, we did that through severance tax and set up different funding sources, predominantly through the CWCB. So when we think of traditional funding sources, we tend to focus mostly on the state, which is CWCB funding, and then also Colorado Water and Power Authority's funding, which comes through the federal government and the EPA through the state revolving fund. But I think it's important to note that that, as was talked about and was on the previous slide, that's a smaller portion of the overall funding. Most of the funding for the water projects that we do, both in water supply and in wastewater, comes from the end users themselves. In most cases, it's local municipalities or districts that do it through using their rates and tap fees to fund and finance municipal bonds. In the case of agricultural users, it tends to be, the private funding, that is the producers that come up with the funding for a lot of their projects, and then environmental groups fund a lot of the environmental needs through nonprofit and NGO funding. So I think there's a variety of traditional funding sources at the state level, a few small pots left at the federal level, and then the bulk of the funding that is going to meet that 20 billion is going to come from the end users themselves through rates and tap fees that will then tend to go to municipal bonds.
So what is the biggest challenge as we look toward funding the water future?
Yeah, the way that I see it is that we have a lot of funding mechanisms in place, and we do need to continue to look for new funding sources, particularly with the volatility of severance tax, as well as the magnitudes that we've talked about of injecting some new funding in. But I would say, so we can't lose sight of new funding sources, but I would say that the biggest challenge that we have is really the structure of the funding that is in place. And to kind of use an explanation, our current system for the most part is really set up for one individual entity to fund a single project for a single purpose. And if you do that, it's pretty cut and dry. It's easy to evaluate whether or not a Denver Water or a Castle Rock can bond and finance a project, and it's easy to permit a project for a single use, especially if all you have to do is analyze one user. What I think we're going to need, and the biggest challenge, is restructuring a lot of our tools, because we're going to meet most of our needs going into the future through regional projects, multi-use projects that involve a variety of users and a variety of different uses. And as I'm going to talk a little bit about in some of my comments on WISE, as you get into those partnership projects, multiple use projects, the funding mechanisms that we have to be adapted, and we can sort of muddle through it with the current tools that we have. But I think going into the future, we're going to need to develop new tools that are much more streamlined to allow for partnership projects, regional projects, and multi-use projects.
And I think I'd add a little bit to that. I think one of the challenges that I see living in a really small rural community is, I think traditional sources and new creative sources, that's fine for some of the larger projects, but when it comes to small rural communities, I definitely have concerns about that. And then I think just supporting environmental and recreational flows and projects, will remain a challenge.
So as we face some of these challenges, kind of what's happening at the state level, and you have the statewide water investment funding committee slide pulled up. What is that? Can you guys explain some of the current discussions in meeting these challenges?
Yeah, I can start a little bit and then let April chime in. So Section 9, I think it was Section 9.2 of part of the Colorado Water Plan, talked about funding and financing, and it came up with a whole series of recommendations. And then coming out of the Colorado Water Plan, CWCB engaged a group that was called the Statewide Water Investment Funding Committee. So they kind of called it the Funding Committee for short. And that committee comprised of people across the state and with a variety of different backgrounds, both water backgrounds as well as some of the financing and funding entities that both do traditional financing as well as some new financing. And that committee started meeting on a somewhat infrequent but regular basis, and really focused on these 7 items that are put up there. And the purpose was really to look at how could we develop these, what types of things could be implemented, and so we really bid off, these 7 items of what types of things do we need to move forward in order to implement the recommendations that were in that section of the water plan.
And then just talking a little bit about what the state is looking at. Let me just advance the slide. One of the things that right now the Colorado Water Conservation Board is talking about is because of really the excellent financial planning that's been done, and looking at ways that the state can find this additional $25 million in annual supplemental funding. So the idea is that there would be a loan guarantee fund of $50 million in 2017, and this could be used to basically help support some of the regional projects with multiple borrowers or those that just don't have the loan guarantee necessary. Another portion is the Water Supply Reserve Fund of $10 million each year. This would be hopefully additional money for the Basin Roundtable Grant Program. Watershed Restoration Program, $5 million each year. This can help with stream management planning. And then just CWCB projects and programs coming out of non-reversible investments. This would be $10 million each year. So those are all ways that I would say more non-traditional water programs and projects can be funded. Now I should note that this is just being discussed at the CWCB level now, and it would have to have legislative approval.
Great. Thank you, April and Eric, for kind of presenting some of those challenges and approaches. And as we face these challenges, I'd like to shift our discussion now and hear from all of our speakers about some more opportunities that private funding and partnerships can provide in paying for our water future. So first we'll hear from Ben McConahey talking about private investment. Next from Eric discussing partnerships, and then April more on philanthropy. And finally we'll wrap up trying to save some more time for your questions. So Ben has spent 10 years working in business development, project management, and strategic planning roles for a variety of industries. He's now with Hydro Venture Partners, which develops innovative solutions to the water challenges faced by agriculture, municipalities, industry, energy, power, and the environment, while providing attractive returns for its investors. Ben will tell us about the opportunities and challenges inherent to private capital for water funding. Welcome, Ben. And Ben muted himself. Ben, I think you have to unmute yourself so that we can all hear you.
Yep, I think I'm there.
Great, thanks.
All right, well, first of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about Hydro Venture Partners, as well as the role that private capital can play in funding some of the challenges that we're facing here in the water community in Colorado. I want to be clear by saying that neither myself nor my business partners believe that private capital is a silver bullet to the solution, but rather we believe that alternative and innovative financing and asset management tools are necessary as we look at managing our aging infrastructure as well as the widening supply-demand gap. So as I walk through these slides, I'd like you to think about some words or phrases that might come to mind when you think of private investment and its role in Colorado and in water, as it will be relevant to a slide later on in my presentation. The main points that I'd like to make here today are that we really need a comprehensive and integrated approach. Eric had mentioned it before, that they're both traditional and new tools, and obviously we're in the end of some new tools. And we believe that if you develop a portfolio of those tools to help address these problems that we're facing in the water community, we'll be able to accomplish a lot more. And the reality is that there's a lot of private capital out there willing to be deployed into this space. So it's our job to go out there and get it. So Hydro Venture Partners, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on who we are and what we do, but we do think that we have a unique position given our expertise in both the investment and the water communities to be a pioneer for innovative private investment strategies in the water sector. Essentially, our model is a hybrid between venture capital and more traditional infrastructure finance. The specific structure of each of the deals is very dependent on the opportunity itself, the capital partners involved, the stakeholders involved, and obviously the timeline of the investment that we're looking at. To date, we've made investments in and operated water services companies in the energy space, and we're looking to deploy additional capital and make future investments in ways that will allow us to create and enhance value, apart from just being a traditional, the traditional model of just adding capital or providing capital to a solution. So like all investors, we both evaluate and assume risk, but our true differentiator here at Hydro Venture Partners is the fact that we have over 50 years of experience in the water space, over 80 years of combined experience when you look at the investment space as well. And the reality is that we have a better, we're better positioned to identify and mitigate the risks for a particular investment as a result of that experience. And as a result, we can address a lot of the problems on the front end, thereby creating more value on the back end of the investment. Some of the places that we're looking at, obviously you see them on the screen here. Distributed infrastructure, we're working with, we're partnering with state agencies as well as players in the private sector to look at and address one of the primary solutions in the water plan, and that is storage. We believe that a portfolio of distributed solutions in this space will attract private capital. It will shorten the development timeline for a lot of these assets, and collectively it will provide the critical regional solutions that Eric and April talked about earlier. On the technology front, while limited venture capital money has been allocated to the water space, there are plenty of opportunities out there for disruptive solutions in the industrial, municipal, agricultural, and environmental, and with environmental applications. And all of these are capitalizing on efficiencies, cost savings, and new market opportunities. And as we go through, we've been around for 3 years now, we're seeing these technologies gain more and more a larger audience and greater market share as they mature. Currently, we have a database of over 80 technology companies that we've been working with, accelerators and incubators around the country that are looking for capital. High net worth individuals, family offices, institutional capital, they're all extremely interested in deploying capital to these two spaces, and there are tangible investment opportunities in each of them. And there are ways to structure the deals such that all stakeholders involved can benefit from them, and they're offering those solutions in each of those economic sectors, including the environmental space. The investments in these spaces are really being driven by a collective recognition of the importance of effectively addressing our water sourcing, our water quality, and the management challenges that we're facing. And that water is essential for every sector of the economy. And while private capital is starting to take notice, as I mentioned, it's been slow going up to this point. The accelerators and the incubators around the country are really providing a unique environment for some very attractive startups that are providing real-world solutions, and we're excited to see some of those as we work through our investment strategy. We've all seen this slide from Chapter 10 of the State Water Plan, and Eric had referenced some of the traditional versus non-traditional financing that everyone is looking at. The bottom line is, while item 2 in this slide, or in this chart, talks about exploring the public, or the relationship with the private sector, the reality is that most of these are relying on the traditional or additional state funds to be allocated to, or new additional funds to be allocated to the water space. And we believe, and the investment community believes as well, that it's going to become increasingly difficult to rely heavily on the state funds, on those traditional sources, and that there's an opportunity here, to transfer some of that financial risk, some of that market risk, some of that development risk to the private sector to bring more innovative tools to bear and to realize a lot of the goals that are outlined in the State Water Plan. A key point here is that for us to solve the problems we are currently facing, innovation is one of the keys, and that innovation can come in the form of financial innovation, new funding sources. It can come in technological innovation as far as investing in or growing companies that can provide those on-the-ground solutions, or it can come in the form of asset management innovation. And to that point, in our conversations over the past few years, we've talked with entities managing billions of dollars, and they're looking to place hundreds of millions of dollars into the water space. And we need to provide them with those opportunities, and at times we need to look at the structure of those deals and figure out what changes we might need to make in order to allow that capital to flow more freely. So I'll take a look here at just a couple of models that exist in terms of the private capital market. These are all based on the premise, again, that there's no substitute for water across all sectors of the economy, and that depending on the model you're looking at, those particular investors are looking for different things. For example, they might be looking for the disruptive technologies that I mentioned. They might be looking for near-term returns. They might be looking for long-term cash flows, diversifying their portfolio, or addressing social and environmental problems. In terms of the returns that those models are looking at, you're looking at a very similar type of spectrum. Impact investment, while in parallel of generating returns for investors, is primarily focused on the social and environmental benefits. The venture capital and the private equity space are going to be looking for higher returns for their investors, but there are ways to structure deals within those two models, whether it's incorporating grants, loans, or debt, that can bring down the total cost of capital to the end user. And then in the middle, you've got the mutual funds and the exchange-traded funds, which are tied a bit more and linked to the market themselves as a result of them being or tracking indices of companies, and exchange-traded funds in particular are traded much like a stock. So while they want to beat the market, they're a little bit closer in terms of the returns that they're expecting or anticipating in that range. So when you look at the challenges that we're facing, it's really a two-sided equation. And one of the challenges we face on the investment side is that private funding is not exactly apples to apples with public funding, and that means it's not exactly, the key thing isn't exactly where the money comes from or what it costs today. While private funding is typically seen as more expensive right now, we believe that it can be more competitive over the life cycle of a particular asset or investment, and when deployed properly can actually add long-term value that wouldn't otherwise be seen through construction financing loans or things like that. It's interesting, a recent Black & Veatch report that came out called the Strategic Directions, the Market Industry Report, found that the primary concern of utilities, municipalities, commercial and community stakeholders, even in the face of uncertain traditional revenue sources, and those would be the state revolving funds and grants, their primary concern was the political cost of pitching alternative financing strategies. I find that very interesting, and I think it's an example of potentially politics getting in the way of the general good or the greater good, and even perhaps economics. And you see that play out at times when master plans or conservation plans are being developed, 30-year management plans, without a clear understanding in terms of how they're going to pay for it. So as I mentioned, this is a two-sided equation in terms of the fundamental challenges. On the one side, you have the water community that, for the most part, can be reluctant to incorporate some of these innovative, non-traditional financing tools. On the flip side of that, you have the investment community that's new to the water space. They're not sure how to find attractive investments other than what the market might be offering them currently. They're not sure how to incorporate that investment or those investments into their portfolio or mandate. They may not have in-house expertise in water. And so as a result, you have this very slow deployment of capital. While there's interest, the environment is new, and some changes need to happen, and good examples need to take place for the floodgates to open, if you will, pardon the pun. So where do we go from here? Each of the bullets on this slide really are examples of places where private capital is willing to deploy investment, or investments are willing to be made from the private sector. We've seen it. Last year we were out trying to raise a $100 million fund. We had tremendous interest in an assortment of deals that were in our pipeline covering a lot of these areas. And the bottom line is that water truly is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, an undiscovered real asset for private investors. There's plenty of capital out there, as I said, but fundamentally, there is no silver bullet. Private capital certainly is not the silver bullet, but much like a national energy policy, there is a need to incorporate a suite of options. Public funding has been successful so far, but as Eric and April mentioned, is not currently meeting the need that's in the market. So the public financing, bonding, loans, P3s, private equity, philanthropy, these are all important tools to put the pieces together to solve the problems we're facing. Two quick examples. Eric had mentioned WISE. We see in some of the investments we've made and what we're looking to do, we look as a private capital deployer, if you will, to incorporate it in a way that all stakeholders get something out of it. All stakeholders benefit, and I think WISE is an example of that, even with the challenges that it faced. Another example is the One Water effort here that we're seeing in Colorado. Private investment is looking for ways to make those types of efforts more feasible. They're looking for ways to make treatment cheaper. They're looking for ways to make monitoring more accurate and asset management less complicated. So fundamentally, I'll leave you with this one thought and turn it back over, but it's important to know that, private capital and incorporating that into a funding strategy does not have to involve the privatization of assets. It doesn't have to involve the acquiring or speculation of water rights, but rather it's the transfer of risk, the creation of value, and improving resource management across the board. And we hope to do that in Colorado and across the Rocky Mountain West. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Emily and continue the presentation.
Thanks, Ben. It's really good to hear your perspective. And now we're going to turn back to Eric Hecox to hear a bit about the potential of public-private partnerships and his experience with a public-public partnership, further elaborating on the WISE project. Eric?
Great. Can you guys hear me and see my slides okay?
We can hear you. I don't know about your slides quite yet.
Okay.
We just made you the presenter, so you should be able to click on Show My Screen at the top left corner of your GoToWebinar toolbar.
Okay. How's that?
Great.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to cover a couple of things. The first one is that I was going to talk a little bit about P3s, and then I want to talk a little bit about our challenges that we had with the WISE partnership. And the first part of talking about P3s and public-private partnerships and how we've applied some of those principles to a public-public partnership. I did a lot of this work with a good partner of mine, Russ Dykstra. He works with Spencer Fain, and so I want to give credit where credit is due. I took a couple of slides just to help kind of set the stage. Ben really, I thought, said it nicely with areas that private investment can come in and help, and I think P3s are one of those where there's a lot of potential in the future for meeting a number of the needs that we have. So at its real basic level, a public-private partnership is really a contract between a public entity and a private entity, and the whole philosophy behind it is that each party shares the risks and the rewards. So you have to have a balancing of the risks and the rewards in order for a partnership, whether it's public-public or a public-private partnership, to work. Some concepts that we looked at when looking at moving this into a public-public partnership is that we looked at how we could apply these through intergovernmental arrangements. We needed to find ways that we could balance the risk allocations between the various parties that were involved, so that we couldn't have all of the risk on one party and all of the rewards on another. And then we looked at how it could apply to large regional projects, because those large regional projects, as I mentioned in some of my opening remarks, are going to require more and more entities in order to have the financial feasibility or the scale. So when you have those partnerships, whether they're a public-private partnership or a public-public partnership, you have to find ways to balance those risks and rewards so that everybody in the partnership is gaining something. So at its highest level, the WISE partnership that I'm going to talk a little bit about really did that. It was a public-public partnership in that all of the entities that were involved were public entities. It involved Denver Water, Aurora Water, and then the South Metro entities as a three-way partnership. And then under South Metro is comprised of 10 different independent water providers or independent public entities that are all also bound together in a partnership. So we really have a multi-tiered partnership in this project. And the way that the project works is essentially Denver and Aurora provide water that's available when they have water that can be reused to extinction. We use available capacity in one of Aurora's pipeline and treatment plants and get that water down into the South Metro area and then develop the infrastructure to move it throughout the South Metro area. And as you can see, what I've summarized here is that each of those entities have risks that they have to incur in order to be in this partnership, and each of the entities also have rewards that come out of it. So there's something to be gained for all of the entities that are in it. So at its highest level, the main point I wanted to make is that regardless of whether it's a public-public partnership or a public-private partnership, there has to be this sharing of risks and rewards in order for the partnership to work. And I think that even though the example that I'm talking about is a public-public, as Ben was saying, there's a lot of private opportunity there to be able to do similar things on the private side. I want to turn now just for a minute to talk about one of the unique challenges that we encountered with the WISE project that I think is also going to be applicable to other regional partnerships as they move forward into the future. As I mentioned, the main part of the project is that we had to find a way for the 10 entities that are involved in the project on the South Metro side to be able to come together collectively to then meet their collective obligations to both Denver and Aurora. And one of those obligations was building or investing in the infrastructure needed in order to move the WISE water supplies throughout the whole South Metro area. So you can see this is a little bit of a complicated map, but the red lines that go down into the green areas of the South Metro area is really the infrastructure that we needed to build. And then along the top of that is the east-west pipeline, or what we call the western pipeline, that moves water kind of along the top of our service area. And so what these 10 entities had to do is they had to find a way to jointly fund all of that infrastructure. And we looked at a number of models when we were first starting this out. We thought, how could we fund and finance this in the way that makes the most sense? And so we looked at a couple of things. We looked at jointly financing it as a full group. And we quickly learned that you really have to pick one of two extremes on that if you're going to fund and finance an infrastructure project as a group of independent water providers. You either have to have collective liability, which would then mean that all of the entities in the partnership are collectively liable for everybody else. So if Castle Rock doesn't pay its bill, then Parker is on the hook to step up and pay it. Well, as you can imagine, with independent communities, that does not work at all. Nobody wants to, nor can they really politically be liable for somebody else's debt and somebody else's obligations. So then we looked at jointly financing it where you had individual liability. And the problem with that is that all of the financing entities look through the regional organization and look down to the individuals, and basically everybody in the group gets the gets rated or gets the financing of the highest risk person or highest risk entity in the group. So of course that doesn't work for anybody, because 9 out of the 10 could get cheaper financing somewhere else. So we quickly set aside the idea that we were going to be able to jointly finance this. We looked at a couple of other things. We looked at some insurance. We looked at loan guarantee programs that were at the time really at the federal level. We looked a little bit at some private capital, but really none of those really panned out. So what we ended up needing to do is we basically ended up doing individual financing, where each of the individuals come up with their own financing, and then we as the regional entity essentially do a cash call. And we found that this was really the only model that could work. It allowed each of the individuals to get the cheapest money that they can, and no one pays more because they're because another partner isn't financially strong. And it also was good because all of the financial tools that are available were available to every entity, so they could pick the one that worked best for them or the one that they were most comfortable with. Some of the problems that we came into is it was very cumbersome, and it was very uncertain in that when we wanted to do a project, close on a pipeline or sign a contract for construction, all 10 of the individuals had to show up with their money, and if they didn't or didn't do it on time, then nobody in the group could move forward. So there was a lack of flexibility in being able for the group as a whole to move forward. So another problem that we encountered was that that as we sort of had changes in people, changes in boards, that kind of a thing, it makes it very difficult for the entire group to keep moving forward when each of the individuals is in control of their own financing. With 10 different entities, you've got almost 55 board members or more that are involved in making decisions about the financing of a regional project, and it just makes it difficult and cumbersome. So the ability is there with the current tools that we have. We can kind of muddle through, and it works, and I think it's replicable, and we can continue to do it. But as I said in my opening, as we move forward, I think that that the experience that we had really demonstrates that a type of a loan guarantee program that CWCB is exploring, or some additional P3 models or private capital that's able to come in and backstop a regional project like this for a reasonable cost so that it doesn't drive other partners away. I think there's a huge opportunity for those two types of tools to really help make regional partnership projects more viable. So I will end there and be happy to answer questions when we get to the question portion.
Great, thank you, Eric. It's useful to hear about your experience and those recommended tools. So finally, we'll hear from April Montgomery again about the role of philanthropy in funding water projects. It looks like we have April on the line still. There she is.
Great. Do you want to, there we go. I'm going to show my screen. All right. Well, thanks for having me, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy. And welcome to a nonprofit foundation office. I'm surrounded by thank you notes all around in my office, so a little informal here. So the Telluride Foundation, just a little bit about us. We're a community foundation based in Telluride, and we serve San Miguel, Ouray, and West Montrose counties. And we do reactive grant making, which is very typical of most foundations, but we also look at proactive initiatives, and one of those initiatives is a initiative focused on the San Miguel River. Because we see water as really one of the most important issues facing our state. We, along with the El Pomar Foundation, the Gates Family Foundation, the state, including the Governor's Office and the Colorado Water Conservation Board, we hosted a gathering in last February, of the top 65 net worth foundations in the state to learn about water, as well as to talk about how water impacts every topic, with the philosophy being that if you fund education, if you fund early childhood, health and human services, in some way water impacts every area. So that's a little bit highlight of that retreat that we had, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, so today, I think water is a new hot topic, and we have a very unique opportunity to take advantage of that. Money is flowing into water from larger national foundations. When we hosted this gathering of state foundations, it was right after Flint had occurred, and people really got it. As everyone's probably noticed, if you're interested in water, it seems like it's always on the radio. There's new books, there's new documentaries all about water. So also with the state water plan, I think more than ever before, water's become a kitchen table word, and the time is ripe, I believe, to engage donors and foundations. So just a quick summary of the landscape of philanthropy, and I will say the generosity that we have in Colorado. I think we're very lucky. We have a lot of foundations in the state, and it's important to remember that 78% of giving comes not really from foundations, though, but from individuals. We are on an upswing again after the economic downturn. It's important to note that the amount of assets held in Colorado is $12 billion. Most foundations are making grants out of 5% of those assets. Generally, foundations have an endowment, and according to IRS rules, they spend about 5% of those assets. And I'll come back to that later when we talk about a little bit about impact investing. So this slide shows the funding priorities in Colorado. As you'll see, environment is not at the top. It's not as much of a priority as education and health. However, I really believe as that we talk about water to funders, we need to quit pigeonholing water as an environmental issue. It really is so much more than just environment. So a little bit about trends in philanthropy. Traditional donors generally gave to safety net causes, and we used to say that if you showed a picture of a cute baby, you could get people to pull their checkbooks out. Well, that is no longer the case anymore. Donors are much more sophisticated today. Although the amount of wealth is increasing in the world, so are the ways that donors can spend their money. There's really a shift in how donors think about their money and about how they want to make a difference. People tend to want, or donors tend to want, more immediate impacts. They want to be involved. With the access for information, donors react differently to causes. Instead of just trusting you to tell them what the problem is and what the solution is, they can get online and they can search for what they might think would be a better solution. There's so many more ways for them to spend their money, like donor chooses, social enterprises, and crowdfunding. So just a little bit about ways foundations give. I think it's important, and I wanted to remind people here that it's important that foundations they're not just about getting a grant. Foundations typically have reactive grant making and donor advised funds, and that's been traditional, but also I've found that in the foundation world it's really its own brain trust. There's a lot of access to relationships all over the world. Foundations can provide introductions, relationships, technical advice, and they're pros at setting up convenings or meetings and facilitation. I wanted to talk in more detail about mission versus program-related investment. So mission investment comes out of what I talked about earlier, that 5% of assets traditionally spent on grant making. And this can also not only be grants, but it can be loans. It can be very low interest or zero interest loans. The main point is that it's for a program or project that is very much aligned with the mission of the foundation. But also there's program-related investment, and that's the same as when we talk about impact investing. And this is a new hot topic, and it's a little bit about what didn't mention. It's how foundations deal with their endowments. The concept of investing endowed funds into areas more in line with the mission of a foundation is really growing, because in the past foundations may be funding anti-smoking or health, and yet their investments are in oil or tobacco. So I believe that impact investing is really the future, and it has a great potential for foundations. We'll talk a little bit more about impact investing in the next slide. I think there's lots of potential money in water. So the trick, is how you take advantage of this money and how to produce the result and show a financial return. I think right now there's a lot of projects being studied in water. I think we're at a proof of concept stage. Things that are being looked at, for example, are high consumptive crops of lower value being replaced with low consumptive crops of higher value. Also water savings used with in-stream flows. Due diligence is happening on dozens of deals right now. So there's a huge potential for foundations nationwide, which have $3 trillion in total assets in 2013. I wanted to show this slide on the liquid assets project. If you're interested in learning more about impact investing with water, I would suggest that you read the Liquid Assets Project report, and this was funded by the Walton Family Foundation. And you can just find that by Googling it, but it's a very interesting document on how to make impact investing in the Colorado River Basin happen. I also wanted to talk a bit about the Water Funders Initiative. This is, I believe, a very exciting effort by 8 large foundations, and I hope it has a ripple effect to the Colorado foundations. It's a great example of how foundations can work together to solve large problems, to fund larger problems. The Water Funders Initiative has developed a blueprint for philanthropy. I highly recommend reading it, and these foundations recognize the importance of water issues in the future and the need for philanthropy to participate in a meaningful way, as philanthropy can take risks, move faster, as well as be more patient with its investment. Included is a list of the participating foundations thus far. So as you can see at the last bullet, those are the foundations that are part of this initiative. This slide is straight from the blueprint, but it emphasizes how water intersects so many other mainstream categories. And I think that's the messaging we have to have when talking to foundations. The importance to me about the Water Funders Initiative is that it is well-respected foundations who've spent a lot of time and resources to figure out how philanthropy can best be involved in water most effectively. The beauty is that other foundations and donors will listen to their peers. The Water Funders Initiative came up with 6 strategies, and I hope other foundations in Colorado will hop on the bandwagon and want to fund these types of strategies. A lot of these 6 strategies, and I won't list them all, but they align very closely with many of the programs and projects in the Colorado Water Plan. So traditionally, not a lot of Colorado foundations have funded water. And if you're a nonprofit in water, you're definitely agreeing with me. And I think there are a few reasons. It's complex. It's too environmental, and a lot of the Colorado foundations just don't fund environmental projects. It's too political. It's too much of a hot potato, and it's the government's responsibility. I think we have to, as we're seeking grants, we really have to avoid and convince foundations why it's a new world out there, and a lot of these issues are no longer relevant. So here's my advice for seeking funders from donors and foundations. Connect to other sectors. Water touches everything. Think how funders can be involved solving larger issues rather than just providing a Band-Aid. Collaborative efforts, and then projects that align with the Water Funders Initiative. And I wanted to just remind you of how important the stock market is to foundations and philanthropy, as most foundations rely on an endowment and a plan on spending from their interest at about 5% of assets. So if they make 8% in interest, they aren't spending down their endowment. However, that hasn't been the case recently. So financial advisors are saying that in the next 10 years, there could be a 1 to 2% return, which could really make foundations giving slow down. On the other hand, this could be great for program or mission-related investments and impact investing, because why not settle for a 1% or 2% return on investment if that's all you're going to get from the stock market anyway? But right now, I mean, the good news is that advisors are still telling foundations to go ahead and keep spending about 5%, at a 5% rate. So I wanted to go back and just talk a little bit more about the Colorado Foundation retreat held last February and some of the takeaways I got from the funders on their own. And one comment that really struck me was a foundation that had done a listening tour around the state. And they said that no one was talking about water. Well, that was shocking to me. But I also think that this foundation may have, its stated priorities may not include water. And I think that's something that we tend to, if we don't think a funder wants to hear about water, it's not listed as one of their causes that they like to fund, then we'll shy away from that topic. But I think that's where we need to pull them in other ways and explain that water really is an important topic in the state. And I also believe that the funders are interested in helping to solve complex issues and at least being part of the conversation and being at the table. And I think it's a good reminder that if there's a community foundation in your community, or if there's just other large funders that are part of the community, that they really are a good source to be, a good resource to be at the table. Another thing I heard was, tell us how we can make a difference. We need to sit down more with funders and donors and explain the issues that we're trying to solve and let them be involved with coming up with solutions. Maybe the solution is money, but maybe it's relationships and introductions. And then donors and board members will influence how foundations spend their money. So if they think water is a key issue, we will see more money going towards water. And that's the same thing with community foundations. If the community sees water is a big issue, then I think foundations will definitely start looking that way.
All right.
And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, April. It's great to have your perspective. So now we'd like to invite all of our panelists to share their cameras again and come on board to answer a few questions that we have. So the first question comes from Rodney Profit. During the Great Recession, it was my understanding that the legislature borrowed funds from the Colorado Water Conservation Board Water Infrastructure Funding pot of money. If that is true, is there any hope that the legislature will be able to return that money to the CWCB?
April, do you want to
take
that?
I think some of that money's been returned. Eric, what's your understanding?
So my understanding is, yeah, during the economic downturn in the state fiscal crisis, a significant amount of money was diverted from both of CWCB's funding sources into the general fund to help cover other expenses. I can't remember the magnitude of it, but it was up around $100 million, maybe I think it was less than that, but over a series of years it was pretty significant. I think that a small portion of that was returned a year or two ago, but I think the prospects for additional funding coming back are fairly small. It's always there, and I think people were a little bit happily surprised when some of that funding was returned a year or so ago, and that was helpful. But I think that you know, the biggest hope for the funding sources, and I think we as a water community and those interested in funding water projects and infrastructure really need to work on making sure that one, the state has a way to deal with the volatility in severance tax, and then two, you know, nothing is better than having a rainy day fund that isn't the CWCB funding sources, because that tends to be the rainy day fund that gets looked at when there's a general fund shortfall. So I think, yes, it would be great if we had some more of that returned, but I think if we did some diligence as a water community of trying to help find ways that the general fund can be shored up and there isn't the risk that those types of transfers will happen in the future, would be well worth our time.
Great. Thank you, Eric and April. Our next question comes from Jason Mum, and it's a question for Ben. Why would public entities accept a higher cost of capital from private partners if they are already unable to afford low-rate financing through municipal bonds and traditional financing?
Yeah, that's the question we get all the time, and there are situations where it doesn't work, and I think that's where the honesty has to come in that there are places where private capital may not be able to be a player. As I mentioned, though, there are ways in how you structure a deal and how you create long-term value and what other elements you bring to the project that could be attractive to an end user, a municipality or a conservancy district or whomever. But I think the key is, again, it's not apples to apples, but it's also, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to say that private capital is going to be a viable player in every opportunity. I think it's on a case-by-case basis. At times, you know, in the long term, the capital could be cheaper. It's just a matter of how you model it, how you blend it with debt, what other value is being created for the specific entity. So it's a great question, and it's one that we get asked a lot. And again, it's not a silver bullet. So there are cases where that will be exactly the case, where the only way to incorporate private financing is that it is more expensive, and then you might have to look back at the traditional sources.
Great, thanks, Ben. The next question comes from Max Kirschbaum. Please define a cash call.
Oh, certainly. So that was a term that I used. So the way that we're structured is we are, as South Metro, we're a regional authority. So we're basically a governmental entity that is made up of members. So it's basically like a membership club, but all of the members are 10 independent water utilities. So what we did is, as the authority, as the governmental entity, the umbrella entity, we would do a cash call, or basically send our members an invoice for their share of the project, and then what they would pay us would be cash. Now, some of them may have gone out and gotten bonds or gotten loans in order to pay their portion of it, but they're the ones that took out the loan or did their financing, and then when they paid us as the authority, they paid us cash, and then we put that cash into an account and use that to meet our obligations, either for purchasing the pipeline that we purchased or signing a contract to do construction. So that's why I called it a cash call. It's basically sending an invoice to an entity. They can come up with the money however they want, and then they write us a check and pay us, and then we put that in an account and use it to fulfill the obligations of the authority.
Great. Thanks, Eric. The next question we have comes from Sandy White. Today's discussion seems most applicable to affluent metropolitan areas. What models, P3 or philanthropic, exist for poor rural areas?
I can take a first shot, and then I'd love to hear others. I mean, I think there's a variety of things. I mean, one thing that I've been trying to talk about is that the issues that we faced in financing with WISE are similar ones that are going to be faced probably more and more by, you know, either smaller entities in a metro area or smaller rural communities. And they're the ones that are going to, in order to do larger infrastructure projects, are really going to need to be the ones that are doing the partnerships. And so the tools that we're developing for partnerships and regional projects, I think in the future are going to be more applicable to smaller infrastructure projects, either be they small groups of entities in a metro area or rural entities that are binding together in order to do a partnership project. So I think they're certainly applicable. And just to echo what Ben has been saying, you know, I don't think there's one silver bullet. I think there's a lot of the philanthropy side that April talked about that are highly applicable, probably more so to smaller rural areas than they are to the metro region. And then there are different tools that are applicable for more, you know, wealthier entities, but they may be smaller and have to come together into partnerships like the ones in my group. So I think all of these tools are, you know, none of them are a silver bullet for everybody, but I think all of them have applicability in both a variety of different geographic areas as well as interest areas for ag producers, M&I, environmental users, all of those. I think these tools are what we're going to need to be looking at in the future.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. Eric had mentioned regional solutions, and I think that'll be a critical piece in how you get in those smaller rural communities to be a part of it. And again, there might be some rules of the game that need to change in terms of how the financing takes place so that the risk and the reward are shared, as Eric mentioned with WISE. I think the other piece from our perspective as well is, and it gets back to a question that was asked of me before, in terms of when private capital can be a player. And one of them is in terms of our investments in technology companies, either the starting or the growing of companies that apply solutions to a rural community that, again, this is looking long term. While right now, let's say you integrate a treatment or an asset management software program or whatever it might be seemingly expensive right now, but if you look at the cost savings that can have over the long term, whether it's saving on water, whether it's saving on in-house communications or marketing or materials going out to the customers, there are ways that you can balance that initial cost with the cost savings over the long term that make it more viable for those communities. And again, whether you're looking at an impact investment or all the way up through some sort of venture capital or private equity play, each of those models can integrate within that differently. If you're looking for a longer term cash flow or a shorter term return, one of those may not be the best play. But I think the regional solutions and the investments in the technology are critical. And also we have to keep thinking about it, and we hear it all the time at Water Congress and other places where, you know, what's the cost of doing nothing? And there is, at some point, whether it's a collective regional solution, those rural communities are going to have to to make difficult decisions and figure out how they're going to pay for those. And that's where I think the suite of options are the way to look at what's the best fit for them.
Yeah, I would add to that, suite of options definitely, and I do think that the traditional sources right now for rural communities like USDA grants and federal grants and DOLA and things like that, rural communities are so dependent on that, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think, and I think those agencies, including philanthropy and funders, understand the importance and the crisis that we have right now in terms of infrastructure and how are we going to deal with that in these rural communities. So I acknowledge the issue and the problem, and I think people are aware of it, and my only hope is that these funding pots that we have now, people will understand the importance of continuing them.
Great. Thank you all. So we have one more question. This comes from Ian Lyle. Ben, do you think that private equity would be willing to provide funds to an entity that operates but does not hold title on a federal facility? An example is doing work on a Bureau of Reclamation project.
I certainly would look into it. I think I would need to better understand the relationship and making sure that the entity, the federal agency, is at the table. But I think there are plenty of ways. We're looking at the distributed solution in terms of storage. We're working with a state agency that may not own something outright. They may own the minerals. There might be a situation where we're working with a municipality where they have a third-party operator of a treatment facility. So I think when you look at private financing, the key is what's the time horizon and what are the returns? And if it makes sense and the players are in the same room having the conversation, there are ways to structure the deals that all parties involved can benefit from it. So absolutely, there are ways to make all those situations work.
Great. Thank you again to all of you panelists, and thanks to everyone on the line for sticking around. We will send out a recording of today's webinar for future reference. And again, we encourage you to take the next step by checking out CFWE's Headwaters magazine and attending Colorado Water Congress's conference next week. For more information and to hear about other upcoming programs, visit us online. And on behalf of the Colorado Foundation for Water Education and Colorado Water Congress, we'd like to thank our presenters for their time and the audience for their participation and questions. This concludes our webinar broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.